This first episode on Conquest is going to serve as a digital companion to my article, Conquest Digital Form. I wrote this article as I was exploring some historical conquerors and comparing these individuals to some of the most prominent and powerful individuals in the modern world. And I really wanted to explore what conquest looks in its most modern form and what individuals can be considered modern-day conquerors. I don't think people necessarily think of these individuals as conquerors, but as I will lay out in this article, you can draw direct comparisons between the behavior of some ancient conquerors, such as Napoleon and Julius Caesar, and people that are widely labeled as conquerors in modern society. But some of the individuals that we're going to explore in this article are not necessarily considered conquerors in the modern context. They usually fall under different labels, but I want to outline the characteristics that they share with ancient conquerors. So I want to start this off with a quote from Genghis Khan. "The greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather into your bosom his wives and daughters." That is a quote from Genghis Khan, and it's really a bit of a skin-crawling quote. He's describing how much happiness he derives from the act of conquest, which in ancient times was to literally march your army towards an enemy, to drive them before you, and to reduce their cities to ashes, to conquer their cities, to conquer their homeland, and to take into your possession their wives and daughters. This is what ancient conquerors did. They conquered cities, they conquered areas of land, and they killed all of the men, all of the fighting age men, and took their women and children to, take as wives and to reproduce with. And it was the brutal reality, the harsh reality of the ancient world. And so Genghis Khan is talking about how much joy he gets from engaging in the act of conquest there. And that gives a little bit of insight into the psychology of a conqueror. And I want to start by laying out what conquest really means. What can we define conquest as? It's important to have a solid definition for it, obviously, before doing a deep exploration into it. So, conquest refers to the act of acquiring control over a country, territory, or people through the use of force. It involves the subjugation and domination of one group by another, often leading to significant changes in political, social, and economic structures. It's been a fundamental part of human history and has shaped the development of civilizations, nations, and empires. So there's a really interesting YouTube video that lays out the history of the Earth and goes in chronological order. And as you watch the map of the world in this YouTube video, you see these different empires rise and slowly take over huge areas of land. And then you see them come under attack by another empire, and their land mass shrinks down and they become conquered. And it's really an incredible video to watch. I highly recommend it. If I remember, I'll put the link somewhere in my article. But if you just watch this, it's really interesting to see these empires grow and scale and then come under attack and fall apart and collapse and be taken over by other empires. But this has really been the trend throughout human history. Certain empires, certain groups of people have come to power, and often you have a conqueror leading the drive and amassing land for that empire and expanding out and conquering. Conquest obviously hasn't been around all throughout human history, and we'll dive a little bit more into the evolution of conquest in this article. But for a large percentage or a decent portion of human history, there's been empires at play, fighting for land, individuals trying to conquer for glory and for legacy, and we'll dive more into the psychology and the reasons why people engage in conquest in the first place. So I do want to point out that, again, conquest is not something that has gone away. We don't think of conquest being very prevalent in the modern world, but in this article, one of the ideas that I really try to push forward is that conquest is still indeed very relevant in the modern world. It just looks different than it used to. It doesn't involve as much, brute force coming in, taking over land through physical violence. It involves more of a digital type of conquest, which we will really, really dive into later. So I do want to just dive in a little bit more into the concept of conquest, what it really is at its core. So at its core, conquest is the act of one entity acquiring control over another through the use of force. So conquest involves one entity gaining a degree of power over another entity through the use of force. Power meaning the ability of one entity to control another, to engage in violence against another, to influence another's behavior, to restrict another's freedom or movement or rights. That is really what conquest is all about. So in ancient terms, we had conquerors going around with armies and attacking cities, exerting their force through violence, coming into the city and killing all of the military-age men. So that's an act of violence, and using that violence to take control over that land and over the resources on that land, the money, the gold, the women, and the children, which are a valuable resource to an empire, because they can have children and expand their empire through the women, and they can take the children and they can teach them, bring them into the ways of said empire, and raise them to be warriors so that they can further go out and take more land. So conquest is all about acquiring control over other entities so that you can expand your influence and expand your power. That's what conquest is all about. So it's really important to understand the concept of conquest so that you can apply it to the modern world, because again, it changes forms over time, it evolves over time, but the core concept of conquest stays the same. So just a little metaphor analogy to really drive this idea in, and further show how you can apply the concept of conquest to things that don't necessarily look like conquest. So if we were to expand the definition of conquest slightly, we could say that the sun has conquered our solar system, because the sun, a massive star, asserts the force of gravity on the solar system, keeping the planets in orbit around the sun. So we could say that the sun has conquered the solar system in a way, because it exerts its force, the force of gravity, on the planets to keep the planets under the sun's control. And obviously this is a massive personification of the sun, but it just goes to show how you can apply the concept of conquest to things that don't necessarily look like conquest. Okay, cool. So I do want to do a little bit more of an exploration applying conquest to two other things that will really drive the concept through, and then we'll dive into what conquest looks like in its most modern form. So conquest of the mind is another area that conquest can be applied and has been applied throughout history. Here is a quote: "You must conquer your mind before you can conquer the world." This is a famous quote from Swami Sivananda. I can't say that name even. I actually don't know who this person is, but I'm going to pull them up right quick because I'm actually kind of curious. Sometimes I just take quotes from people I don't even know who they are. So this person was a guru and yoga instructor, and so that's very interesting. So this guy was obviously very much in this guy, I say. He was a famous guru. So he was obviously involved with a lot of mental activity. He was a yoga instructor, so I'm sure he was very much engaged in the spiritual aspects of yoga. And so he applied this idea of conquest to the mind with this famous quote: "You must conquer your mind before you can conquer the world." And I think that's a really interesting quote too, because it kind of states that in order to engage in conquest, the conquest of the world, you must have control over your own mind. And this is an area where the concept of conquest has been applied quite frequently throughout history. Different philosophers have referred to the act of conquest of the mind as well. And basically what conquest of the mind involves is you are taking your conscious mind and using it, because that's the only thing you really have control over at the end of the day, is your conscious mind and your conscious actions. So you're taking that part of your mind that you have control over and using it as a force to exert on the rest of your mind, to conquer your mind, to be able to utilize your mental facilities, your mental energy in a more focused manner. So, for example, as human beings, we have, very fragmented mental spaces because we have all of these base instincts, base drives that are influencing our behavior, and then we have our more conscious, higher level facilities. Our brain is not one single unit that is always acting in perfect alignment, but through strengthening your conscious mind and your ability to focus and your ability to overcome your base instincts and the ability to suppress emotions is something that can be developed, and it's something that you can engage in a form of mental conquest by using your conscious facilities to overcome all of the other forces that are operating in your mind, negative emotions, bad memories, like negative self-thought. I know in the self-development space, a big thing is eliminating negative thoughts about yourself, of not thinking, about yourself as worthy or capable. That you can engage in a form of conquest where you conquer those negative thoughts, where you conquer those parts of your brain that are not acting in a way that is leading to your success, or in the case of a conqueror, in your ability to conquer other lands, other people. I'm sure if an individual like Genghis Khan was having negative self-thoughts about not being capable, I'm sure he was ruthless in weeding out those thoughts because he was focused on the mission at hand, which was to conquer as much land as he possibly could. And anything else, I'm sure any other thoughts that tried to get in the way of that happening in his mind, I'm sure he was ruthless about weeding those out. Another form another example of an area where conquest has been applied is the sexual realm. And there's this idea of sexual conquest and this particularly applies to a man, but it can also apply to a woman in certain scenarios where people engage in sexual conquest, where they're trying to conquer another individual romantically or sexually. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a coercive force, although, throughout much of human history, there was a lot of coercive sexual interactions occurring, especially with the ancient conquerors. Like we talked about earlier, they were invading areas, killing all of the men, and taking the women by force to use them as sexual partners and to have more children. And, many conquerors throughout history, as we'll talk about, had an innumerable number of children. So I kind of dive into the article an example of how a man trying to seduce a woman can be viewed as a form of conquest. So I actually do want to read through that briefly. So in the example, I say, let's say a man approaches a woman and tells her that she's beautiful. So he's trying, he's attracted to this woman and he wants to, the end goal, usually when a man finds a woman extremely attractive and tries to seduce her, the end goal is almost always sex. So the man approaches the woman, he tells her that she is beautiful. The first interaction is very, we don't think of it as an application of force, but in the technical sense, it is an application of force. He's speaking words to her, so it's a very light form of force. But when you speak to someone, you're applying a verbal force. Sound waves are flying through the air and hitting their eardrums, so it is technically a form of force that you're applying to them, as light as it may be. And so he goes up, he tells her that she's beautiful. Unless the woman signals a resistance to this force, it's highly likely that the man will continue talking to her, right? Unless she says, ew, get away from me, he's going to continue talking to her. And, she might even be receptive to his approaches. In that case, it's all green lights, and he continues to speak to her. This force will eventually escalate. I mean, chances are he's going to ask her on some form of date or whatever, the normal mating process. Let's say they go on a date. Eventually, when you have a man trying to engage in a sexual interaction with a woman, things are going to begin to get physical eventually. He's going to start to touch her, lead her. This is the usual process. And so if the woman is still receptive and does not resist the force or signal any resistance to it, he's going to continue to slowly or, sometimes even quickly escalate this physical interaction. They're going to kiss, they're going to get more physical with each other, etc., etc. Eventually, this all leads to a sexual interaction, the actual act of having sex, which, as everybody knows, is a very, physically intense interaction where a man is applying much more force onto a woman than the initial interaction where it was just words, you're beautiful. So we can think of this whole process as a form of conquest where the man is applying more and more force onto the woman until the pinnacle is the sexual interaction. And once a man has a sexual interaction with a woman, he has gained a degree of control over it. And I don't really want to dive into all of the evolutionary mechanisms for this, but women have evolved to become emotionally attached to men that they've had sex with, because there's a chance that they are going to become pregnant and they're going to be vulnerable and they're going to need the support from a man. So women are highly likely to develop an emotional attachment to men that have had sex with them. And so this is an exact really fits the exact definition of conquest. And I want to reiterate that real quick. Conquest at its core is the act of one entity acquiring control over another through the use of force. So as we just looked, the man has now acquired a degree of control over the woman because he's seduced her, he's applied physical force through romantic interactions and then the sexual interaction, which is the greatest application of force. And now he has a degree of control over her because she is now emotionally attached to him due to the evolutionary reasons. And I'm not saying that every single sexual interaction ever leads to the woman being under the complete control of the man, but in general, this is the evolved emotional response for women when they have sex with men. And even for men when they have sex with women, they often develop an emotional attachment. So this is another example of conquest applied to the sexual realm. So those two examples were really just to further drill in the idea of what conquest looks like and how you can apply the concept to many different things. That's going to help us apply it to the modern world. So now we're going to move in, we're going to start applying it to the modern world, and we're going to talk about something called corporate conquest. And corporate conquest is very relevant in the modern world because we live in a world that's rich with corporations that are competing with each other. So corporate conquest occurs frequently when one company seeks to acquire control over another. So these acquisitions, they can happen when the target company is receptive. So let's say, Microsoft goes and offers a deal to, let's say, Shopify, which is a big e-commerce platform. Microsoft says, okay, we are going to offer you a deal. We want to acquire your company. And Shopify may say, okay, cool, we like your deal. We'll do a little bit of negotiations and we'll make this happen. But in some cases, Shopify's leadership might say, no, we're not going to be acquired by you, Microsoft. We're not interested. And then what can happen then is Microsoft can choose to engage in a hostile takeover. And this happens quite frequently in the corporate world. So in a hostile takeover, the target company's management does not consent to the acquisition. And the company that wants to acquire them bypasses the management and can directly offer to buy shares from the shareholders. And so what they're doing here is they're using a monetary force to acquire control over a company where the management is not receptive, where the management does not want to be acquired. So this is more of a forceful act of conquest in the corporate world, where they've now bypassed and they're exerting their force to get what they want, which is the acquisition of this company. And there's been anti-monopoly laws that have been implemented to prevent large companies from just dominating entire industries. But these are not always the most effective because these companies have so much power. It's like Meta, or previously Facebook, was able to acquire Instagram, a massive social media company, regardless of these anti-monopoly laws that were in place. And it's completely up for debate whether or not that should have been blocked by these anti-monopoly laws. And with a lot of these big tech conglomerates, arguably monopolies, it's questionable whether or not they should have been able to make certain acquisitions that they've been able to make. Like, for example, Microsoft moved in and invested a lot of money in OpenAI, which created ChatGPT. And so Microsoft is an enormous company with an enormous amount of power, and now they are exerting their force on new AI technologies. The biggest large language model, ChatGPT, they're exerting their force over, and it's very questionable whether or not they should be allowed to do this based on how much power they already have. But it's really hard to stop big entities when they decide that they want to make acquisitions or they want to come in and exert their force on new companies, because they have so much power. You need a force that's more powerful than them to slow them down. And so this just really illustrates how Conquest works, how entities try to conquer other entities, and how they're going to use different forms of force to do that. And so now I want to briefly look at the evolution of Conquest. What did it look like in the early stages of humanity? How did it evolve over time? And then finally, we'll loop back around to what it exactly looks like now. So if you go way back in human history and go back to hunter-gatherers, there wasn't a whole lot of conquest going on with them as we understand or as we think, because they functioned very efficiently in small, self-sustaining groups, so there wasn't really a need of conquering large groups of people. They were more preoccupied with dealing with nature, because nature was posing a lot of problems to them. They were trying to fight against dangerous predators, tigers and big cats, and there was all sorts of things that could kill human beings in nature. Human beings were very, very vulnerable in the hunter-gatherer stage, and mostly just focused on collecting enough food to get by, and constantly having to travel to new areas as the weather changed, because we didn't have the technology that we have now to keep ourselves warm and be able to survive in harsh climates. So constantly on the move, constantly looking for food, and conquest wasn't really as much at play as it is now, or as it was a couple hundred years ago or a couple thousand years ago. Then the agricultural revolution came around, and this brought major changes to the way that humans live their lives. So now, thanks to agricultural surpluses, people could stock food and spend more time developing specialized roles, and complex social hierarchies were able to take form. More people were able to be born because there was more access to food, and so larger groups of people began to emerge, and there was more competition over resources like land and water. So people had more control over their environment, had enough food, had surplus food, had specialized roles, were able to group together, and now they could start competing with each other for more access to resources like land and water. Eventually, states began to form with centralized authorities, and this allowed people to organize large armies and engage in the act of systematic conquest. At a certain point in human history, empires such as the Roman, Persian, and Macedonian empires expanded through systematic military conquest, and these empires were able to take control over enormous areas of land, and they would conquer cities. They would conquer states and add them to their empire, bring up the children in the ways of the empire, raise warriors, and go out and expand and take more land, more resources. They wanted to expand their ideas, their language, their religion, their way of living life, their lifestyle, their culture. They wanted to expand, exert their force on as much land as possible. And this is when these really ambitious individuals such as Caesar and Alexander the Great began to emerge and go around and conquer for glory and for resources and for family legacy, to have as many children as possible. There's religious components to this, doing it for the gods, etc., etc. Human society was much more complex, large, organized than it was back when humans were just hunter-gatherers just trying to get by. People had more time to accumulate ideas and stories and more time to worship the gods. So this all led to the expansion of all the motivations that conquest is driven by. And then once the early modern period was reached, European powers began to explore and conquer territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, leading to the establishment of vast colonial empires. So this is the colonial period where European powers began to expand across the entire world. So this is, an even more expanded form of conquest. Previously, a lot of conquest was done by marching armies on foot. It was a bit slower. There wasn't as much transportation. They couldn't conquer as vast of areas. They couldn't really get to other continents. They were, they had less of an idea of what the landscape of the entire world looked like. There was a little bit less communication. So now you have these European powers that, with all of these new technologies, but the same drivers of the conquest, trying to spread their culture, trying to get control of resources, more land, more money, doing it for the gods, etc., etc. And so now you have these vast colonial empires. You have innovations in navigation, weaponry, shipbuilding. So now they can engage in overseas conquest. And this period saw the rise of the Spanish, Portuguese, and British empires. And these empires began to engage in conflicts with each other, competing for control over the world, control over all of the new land that they were discovering. This period lasted for quite some time, and these different empires had their various runs. They came to the Americas and conquered a lot of civilizations that were already in place in the Americas, and this was really a very interesting period of time, because you had these civilizations in the Americas that didn't even know there were other empires around the world, and then all of a sudden you have these people showing up and coming and conquering your empires, and it was a very, very interesting period of human history. A lot of people died, a lot of land was conquered, and all for the same motivations that the original Roman empires and Persian empires were doing their thing. Then you have the Industrial Revolution come about, and you have more massive advancements in military technology, more destructive and widespread conflicts. You have Germany, Nazi Germany, trying to conquer a lot of Europe and even trying to go into Russia. And they did this with, here's one of the key, very interesting things, they did this with tremendous speed thanks to the new military technologies. You had the Blitzkrieg methods of the German, of the Nazi German army. You have them rushing in with tanks, new technologies, new forms of transportation, and new military technologies allowed for rapid conquest of countries. They stormed through France and through many different countries in Europe in record speed. And there'd been other Alexander the Great conquered a large amount of land in a very short period of time, but with Germany, it was extremely quick how fast they were able to move into a lot of different countries in Europe. So these two world wars of the 20th century there was an absolutely unprecedented scale of devastation. So many countries were leveled, so many people died, and the whole world was involved in this conflict in a major way. It was the second of two world wars, and so this just goes to show how big of a scale conquest can take with the technologies that were created during the Industrial Revolution, with the new modes of transportation and the new weaponry. So that's a quick little evolutionary history of conquest leading up to modern times. And so The key revolution that we've had recently, leading Conquest into its most recent form, is the internet revolution, the digital revolution. And this is where things get really interesting with Conquest, and this is when we'll really begin to understand what Conquest looks like today. So, digital conquest is a new form of conquest that's been made possible by this internet revolution, this digital revolution, this world of bits. So obviously the internet was developed in the late 1900s, and since then it has become completely widespread. A large portion of the world is now on the internet every single day, especially, any developed country has completely implemented the internet and digital technologies into really every facet of people's lives. People are spending increasingly more amounts of time online, on digital technologies, on digital platforms, and just using all sorts of digital technologies for every activity in their life, from socializing with friends to their career lives, to what they do for work, to their romantic lives on dating apps and these types of things. People spend a lot of time in the digital world now, and so this has led to the emergence of this form of digital conquest. And so what we see now is some of the largest entities, the most powerful entities in the world, are digital companies that have carved out a space for themselves in this digital information economy. And so these companies are, again, they're some of the most powerful in the world, and we can actually think of them as digital empires. And what we'll do is we'll take a brief look. Do they meet the criteria for an empire? And one of the criteria for an empire is that empires usually engage in a form of warfare. And indeed, there are many different forms of digital warfare that we can identify. So cyber warfare is a great example, and cyber warfare involves the use of digital attacks against an adversary's computer system, networks, and infrastructure with the intent to disrupt, damage, or control them. And cyber warfare is something that is used by nation states, terrorist organizations, and even private sector entities to inflict damage on and control their enemies. So there are private companies around the world that engage in cyber warfare. Information warfare is another prominent form of digital warfare. This involves the manipulation, distortion, or control of information to influence public perception, disrupt communication, and undermine the enemy's decision-making process. This includes things like propaganda, disinformation, fake news, psychological operations, and media manipulation. And digital technology companies certainly engage in this type of information warfare. Some of them engage in cyber warfare as well. We also have drone and autonomous systems warfare. This is another widespread use of unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned ground vehicles, and autonomous systems for surveillance, reconnaissance, and direct attack missions. So some of the wars that are taking place right now in the 21st century, we're seeing more and more activity, or more and more attacks, we'll say, using drone and autonomous systems, as well as cyber warfare. There's a lot of digital attacks going on. There's a lot of drones being used, a lot of new weapons that rely on digital technology to operate, and a lot of private companies are the ones developing these different weapons and these different forms of warfare, and in a lot of cases they're working with the government hand in hand to implement these different types of weaponry. We also have social media warfare, where social media platforms are being weaponized to conduct psychological operations, influence public opinion, recruit personnel, and gather intelligence. And social media platforms are certainly engaging in this form of warfare, where they're taking control over massive amounts of data, and they're using it to psychologically influence populations of people. So that is one of the key characteristics of conquest, as we discussed earlier, which is empires try to assert their force, their influence over a population of people to take control over them. And what that used to mean was you would have to go in and kill all the military-age men who would be the ones that would rebel against you, and you would take their women and force the women to fall into line because the women are a little bit weaker, less capable of rebelling. And then you would take the children and you would teach them in the ways of your culture. Now, with social media, what they can do is you don't necessarily have to use violence anymore. All you have to do is take control over the digital platforms that people are spending all of their time on and manipulate the information that people are receiving so that you can influence their decisions, and you can essentially take control over them just through the information that you're showing them, because these digital platforms play such a major role in their worldview and their decision-making processes. All you need is to change the information that you're showing them on these platforms. And also on these platforms, people have, no ownership of their information, their data. They don't even have control over their own accounts. Social media platforms can take your account away whenever they feel like it. And they've deplatformed tons of influential individuals to manipulate narratives and to control information. So social media warfare is extremely prominent, especially with these big tech companies. Another example of these tech companies exerting their force on the world is with these new artificial intelligence technologies, these large language models. They're feeding all of the information on the internet into these large language models. They're using pirated versions of books that they can't get their hands on because of copyright laws. They're just using the pirated version. So these AI companies are going in, and just because they're so powerful and they command so much capital and computing power, they can just come in and steal any information that they want. They can steal from creators, from websites. They can scrape much of the internet and just take all of the information and feed it into their models. And this is highly questionable whether or not they should be allowed to do this, whether or not they should have to compensate people for this information. A human being would never be allowed to go around and just take all of the information available, to use for business purposes, for monetary purposes. But this is exactly what these AI companies have done. And it's because they're so powerful and they have so much control over people's data and over information that they can really just go in and take whatever they want, feed it into their models, and use it for monetary purposes. And so you can think of a lot of these companies like digital empires who are exerting their force on the digital world, which is humans are spending increasingly more time on the digital world. So it's very much taking control over other human beings when you're coming into a space that human beings spend so much time on, and just, conquering and taking information and just using all of that for monetary purposes. I want to dive a little bit into the conqueror and the psychology of the conqueror, because then we can take a look at some modern conquerors. So here's a quote from Julius Caesar, famous quote that a lot of people know. I came, I saw, I conquered. And it's a very interesting quote where he's just saying he showed up, he saw something that he wanted, and he took it. So the conqueror is the entity applying force in order to obtain control over another entity. Conquerors are often the individuals in charge of the empire and who are ambitious enough to go out and conquer new lands, and they're often military generals in a historic sense. They're leading an army to go conquer new lands. Here's a quote from Napoleon Bonaparte. "Power is my mistress. I have worked too hard at her conquest to allow anyone to take her away from me." So that's a very interesting quote where he's basically saying, at the end of the day, what he's after is power. And that's what he's trying to conquer, is power. And he's worked so hard that he's not going to allow anyone to take power away from him. So that really gives another insight into the psychology of conquerors. Napoleon, obviously one of the greatest conquerors of all time, if not the greatest. So all humans, to varying degrees, seek a degree of control over their environment. We've created all sorts of technologies to allow us to better do this, like forms of transportation and homes and artificial environments to insulate ourselves from the dangers of nature, etc., etc. We want to have a certain degree of control over our environment. It's in human nature to do that. Some people have different levels of ambition for how much control over their environment they want. So some people are content with just having control over, say, their house, their shelter where they live, and their children. Maybe they want to be a manager at their business, etc., etc. Other individuals have a much greater hunger, a much greater ambition for what they wish to control, for how much of a mark they wish to leave on the world, how much influence they want, how much resources they want access to. So conquerors are individuals that want to control as much land and people as possible. Historically, the great conquerors, even after acquiring enormous empires, kept pushing further and further to try to conquer more and more. And we see this all throughout history. We see Napoleon pushing the limits. We see Alexander the Great pushing the limits. Genghis Khan, all of the great conquerors. They didn't just, and that's why they were such great conquerors, because they didn't just stop after they conquered one state or one city. They said, okay, we have this city now, we're going to keep going. We're going to keep conquering more and more and more and more, exerting more force, as much land as possible, constantly pushing the limits. And this is why they're the great conquerors, because they were always trying to grow bigger and bigger, expanding their influence more and more, and getting as much getting as much as they could possibly get. That was what that's what their life was all about. They wanted more power, more control, and that's why Napoleon says that he's worked too hard at conquering power to allow anybody to take it from him. He's worked relentlessly to acquire as much power as possible, and that's the some of the characteristics of a conqueror. And I think it's important to understand the reason for this. Like, why would someone have that great of an ambition? Why would someone want endless amounts of resources and land? Why would someone keep constantly pushing for more and more and more? So from an evolutionary perspective, behaviors that enhance the survival and reproductive success of individuals are generally selected for due to evolutionary pressures. Many of the greatest conquerors throughout human history had an enormous number of children and mates, and I think that's something that's important to point out. Reproductive success was part of their mission, was part of their base motivation. So Genghis Khan fathered hundreds of children, with genetic studies suggesting that his descendants make up a significant portion of the modern Central Asian population, which is really crazy to think about. So he was obviously a very successful conqueror, and due to that enormous success, he was able to pass down his genes to so many people. So that was one of the motivations, and that might have been a subconscious motivation potentially, where subconsciously his mind, his brain, his being wanted to pass on those genes. Sultan Moulay Ismail, I don't know if I said that right, of Morocco, he is reputed to have fathered over 1,000 children, possibly even more, earning him the Guinness World Record for the most children fathered by a single man. He had a harem that reportedly included hundreds of wives and concubines, and this was a quite frequent thing. Different conquerors and leaders of great empires had hundreds of concubines that were reserved for them to reproduce with. Sultan Murad of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Murad III of the Ottoman Empire, his harem included over 1,000 women, comprising wives, concubines, and attendants. So that just shows how large some of those harems were, which is an unbelievable size, over 1,000 women. It's actually very hard to comprehend in the modern world to have that many women reserved for yourself. So these are just a few examples of conquerors throughout history that attained, massive amounts of women, and were able to have an enormous number of children because of that. So I also want to point out that conquest is a high-risk, high-reward behavior, because especially in ancient times, these conquerors were often literally leading their men into battle. So they risked being killed in battle. And then on top of that, when you're trying to amass enormous amounts of power, you make a lot of enemies, and you have to worry about people turning on you, trading on you, trying to assassinate you, your enemies and your friends, because your friends might want to take that position of power from you. And so it's a high risk, high reward behavior. You risk being assassinated, killed in battle, But if you succeed and you're able to conquer a lot of land and become very powerful, you can have a lot of children, a lot of access to females, either through because females are attracted to you because of your power, or through coercive methods, which is were common especially in ancient times, as women were more subjugated and taken control of by force. So I wrote in my article, the genes of many of these great conquerors were very happy, to say the least, because they were able to distribute their genes across a large number of people. And if you've ever read the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, that book kind of dives into how genes seek to replicate themselves. And so these conquerors were very, very successful at replicating the genes of these conquerors. And that goes to show how evolutionarily these conquered genes are selected for in a certain sense, because individuals that possess genes that drive them to conquer are passed on to many people. So this is how this archetype of the conqueror prevails throughout human history, is because the act of conquest is highly rewarding genetically, reproductively, and so that's one of the drivers of it. So if we look at modern day digital conquerors, we can look at some of the most powerful individuals in the world today that have leveraged the power of digital technology to become very powerful, to take control of a lot of digital resources. So essentially, these individuals have asserted their force on the world by taking control of massive amounts of data, as we spoke about earlier with the AI companies and the social media companies. So they're taking control of data, information, and computing power. And these men are constantly pushing for more wealth, influence, and power, despite all of their previous success. Because again, remember, the conqueror doesn't stop at a little bit of land. The successful conqueror, the great conqueror, keeps pushing for more and more, even after they already have a lot of power, a lot of control. And so these modern men can be thought of as modern day conquerors. And I want to dive through and look at a couple of different examples and see if they meet the psychological criteria of a conqueror. So the first one I want to talk about is Elon Musk. So Elon Musk achieved a tremendous amount of wealth when he was involved in the sale of the financial technology company PayPal, and this was back all the way in 2002. And so he became extremely wealthy. I can't remember the exact figure, but I'm almost positive that he amassed a couple $100 million in the sale of PayPal with the other people that helped develop PayPal. And so despite this enormous wealth, he took this wealth and put it into other companies that he founded after selling PayPal, such as SpaceX and Tesla. So instead of Elon Musk going, okay, I developed this incredible company, the company sold, I now have a couple $100 million. He could have just said, oh, I'm just going to, buy a couple nice houses and just chill, have some kids, settle down, sit on a beach somewhere. Instead of doing that, he pushed and he's, I'm going to use this money to start new companies and to continue to change the world and to influence, really his motivation behind all of what he's doing is to try to influence essentially the future of humanity itself. And so he develops SpaceX, he develops Tesla. These companies, had very rocky beginnings, but eventually they become extremely successful and he becomes more wealthy, making him the richest man in the world at one point. And he might be again now, I'm not entirely sure, but he's certainly up there with among the most powerful and richest people on the planet. And then recently, obviously, he decides to acquire Twitter, one of the biggest social media companies in the world, renames it X. And so that was another step, him moving forward, exerting more influence, taking control of more facets of the digital space. And then he has since become more involved in the political space, and he helped Donald Trump get elected in the for president of the United States in this election that just happened recently. So this is one man who started an extremely successful financial technology company, PayPal, which has an enormous influence on the financial world in the digital space, on modern digital banking, fintech. And then he creates a rocket company, an electric car company, and then buys an extremely important social media company. And they're developing AI technologies with large language models. So this is one man who has a tremendous amount of power over the landscape of the digital space and over the future of humanity itself. SpaceX is launching satellites into space, providing internet servers. So this dude has incredible control over the digital space and the future of humanity itself. He's working on cutting edge technologies like artificial intelligence, and he's, controlling a major social media platform. The social media platforms have tremendous power. And he gets Donald Trump elected in the political space. So this is a man who has tremendous amount of power. He can most clearly be labeled as a modern conqueror. I think Elon also has something like 10 plus kids. So he has a bunch of kids, a ton of wealth, a ton of control over some of the biggest digital technology companies in the world. And he keeps pushing for more and more influence over humanity's direction. And this is not to say like he's a bad person or anything. But he certainly exhibits the conqueror spirit. He's using his money, his capital, his power to influence more and more, to control the direction of more and more industries within the digital space. Another example of an individual, a digital conqueror, if you will, is Bill Gates. He founded Microsoft back in 1975. It's, widely documented that he employed aggressive business strategies to maintain and expand Microsoft's market share before stepping down as CEO of Microsoft. So a lot of time, and this is something that a lot of these digital conquerors, if you will, these tech CEOs will do, is they'll engage in very aggressive business strategies at times to maintain the power of their company, or we could call it digital empire, which we'll discuss in a little bit. And then so Bill Gates steps down as CEO of Microsoft, and instead of just going, okay, I got all this money, I'm filthy rich, I'm just going to step back, just chill on my yacht. Instead of doing that, he rolls a lot of that money over into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization where Bill runs around the world focusing on things like global health, education, poverty alleviation, etc., which in a lot of scenarios is him running around going to Africa, vaccinating kids, re-educating people. So it is a philanthropic institution, which doesn't sound like the vehicle for a conqueror, but in many ways he's using this to exert influence on the world through all of this money that he has. He's influencing governments around the world. He's influencing health policy, and he's not just back there passively. He's actively trying to influence the world through this philanthropic organization, and I think pretty much everyone realizes that by now. And he's engaging in financial, you could call it financial warfare in a sense, where he's taken, he's shorted Tesla. He's been known to short the Tesla stock on many occasions, and Elon Musk has clapped back about this behavior many times. Bill Gates is very active in trying to influence the world and the direction that the world's moving in. Mark Zuckerberg is another example. Founded Facebook, quickly became the most popular social media company in the world. Since then, it's grown into this massive digital empire, has since been renamed Meta. We talked about how Facebook acquired Instagram and has engaged in things that are arguably monopolistic. It's now a massive conglomerate, completely involved in driving the future of the digital revolution, trying to develop this thing called the metaverse, but having a massive influence on the digital aspects of our existence. And again, Zuckerberg's a perfect example of someone that's always pushing for more, despite his enormous power, influence, success, constantly pushing for more, trying to develop new technologies, trying to go into more industries. Meta's also heavily engaged in developing artificial intelligence, etc., accumulating more computing power and really trying to maintain their power and increase their share of the digital world. So, and we'll briefly talk about some of the characteristics of the empire. so that we can further solidify the idea of a digital empire, and that's really where we will wrap this article summary up. So the empire is the entity that the conqueror is in command of. Oftentimes, these empires outlive the men that have carved them out in the first place. Sometimes they don't, but many times they do, and you have a new leader is put in charge. But empires do have a sort of life of their own that often lasts longer than the person who formed or the people that were involved in forming the empire in the first place. But empires do share common characteristics, common traits. So a lot of times empires pursue aggressive expansionist policies to acquire new territories. And as we talked about, many of these digital tech companies engage in just that, aggressive expansionist policies within the digital world. Centralized authority. So empires typically have a strong central government that exercises authority over distant provinces and regions. And this is exactly what we see with the digital technology companies. For example, Facebook is all across the globe and influences things going on in countries far, far away from where the primary headquarters are of Facebook. So with the digital tech companies, it's easier than ever to engage in authority and to exert your force and influence on faraway places, because the digital world, encompasses the entire globe. As long as you have an internet connection, the internet connects all countries together. So military strength is another example. Empires maintain large, well-equipped armies to defend their borders, suppress rebellions, and conduct further conquests. So you need this military strength. You need this ability and military strength is just one way to exert your force. Military is obviously you're exerting your force through violence, but as we saw earlier, there's other ways that you can exert your force other than just violence, especially in the modern world, especially in the digital world. Economic control. Empires exploit the natural resources of their territories to support the central state and fund further expansion. So empires, they want economic power. They want control of resources, of capital, of money. They want control over as much economic assets as they can control, because this helps with their expansion. This helps them maintain their power. So the digital empires in the modern world certainly meet these criteria. And there's new resources that these digital empires are accumulating, but oftentimes there's a very centralized authority for these digital tech companies. Oftentimes it's just a small group of people fully in charge. The general founder, usually maintains a majority share and a majority say in the direction of the company. And then there's a small group of directors that maintains a level of control over the company. But for the most part, these digital technology companies are extremely centralized. You have a small group of people ranging from, the leadership is usually just a dozen or a couple dozen people. Then you have the employees, but these digital platforms have millions or billions of people on them on a daily basis. And you have a very small group of people who are controlling this digital platform, especially with the AI companies. I think OpenAI only has a couple dozen employees, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, I'm going to look up that statistic real quick. Okay, so OpenAI actually has a couple thousand employees. Let's take a look at X, the number of employees. X has a couple thousand. So these digital empires tend to have, it seems like, a couple hundred to a couple thousand employees, but they're controlling these platforms that have millions or billions of people interacting with them on a daily basis. So it's a very small group of people in the grand scheme of things that are having a global influence, a massive global influence on the flow of information in the digital world. So, and then again, you have like a few people who are making the absolute final decisions. You have a small board of directors in a lot of cases, but they're quite centralized. So that definitely fits that aspect of empires. And then you have military strength. So a lot of these digital tech companies don't technically have militaries in the traditional sense, but they wield massive amounts of computing power, which are essentially the equivalent of a a digital army. The more computing power that you have, the more algorithms, complex algorithms that you have, the more force you can exert on the digital space, because that is really what determines power in the digital world. How much compute do you have? How many complex algorithms do you have? A lot of these digital tech companies have the greatest. They attract the best talent in the world as far as computer programmers and people that can build complex algorithms, and also people with capabilities to engage in cyber warfare and cybersecurity and these sorts of things. So these digital empires, they attract the best talent in the world for people that can develop digital technologies. They amass massive amounts of computing power, and they develop extremely complex algorithms. And so that's sort of like their form of army. They don't necessarily need a military because they have an army in the form of compute and talent and algorithms, which they can use to exert their force on the digital world. And then you have economic control. So big tech companies have an extreme degree of economic control. A lot of these digital tech companies, the amount of wealth that they've accumulated rivals countries all around the world, multiple $trillion valuations, and still growing at a rapid pace. So these digital empires command a tremendous amount of wealth, and as computing power becomes more valuable, as algorithms become more valuable, they're only going to acquire more and more wealth. Now they're developing advanced artificial intelligence, which is going to be an extremely valuable asset. Really, like they're developing new forms of intelligence. So it's hard to say how valuable that will actually become in the marketplace. So for all of these reasons, digital empires are incredibly powerful, and they look very different than empires looked historically, but the same principles, the same concepts still apply. Same goes for the modern conquerors. They engage in a different form of conquest. They certainly look different. A lot of them look like tech nerds compared to, if you look back at Genghis Khan, he was this crazy warrior riding around on a horse with a bow and arrow. Very different look to them, but they're still engaged in the same base activities, which is expanding their power, taking more control over the world and the future of humanity, more influence, more power, more expansion of their empires. The same exact rules and basic principles apply. And so that's really where we'll wrap it up. I wrote this article as an in-depth exploration of the concept of conquest and all of the different forms that it takes. And I think this is a really important concept to incorporate into your mental model of the world. I think it's important to understand that conquest is still very much alive. And, you can revisit this audio recording or this article whenever you need to refresh that in your mind. But I hope this added value to your mental model of the world, and I hope this helps you better navigate the digital space and really understand how big of an impact conquest and conquerors are still having in the modern world. So if you enjoyed this, there's going to be more audio episodes. Check out some of the other podcast episodes, and then obviously you can go to my website, MatthewFrassetto.com, and you might already be on the website right now, and you can check out some of the different articles that I've written. Thanks for listening.